In this second section, A Republican Empire is Born, we discussed the notion of growth on the Americans moving west, taking up Native American land, and we talked about how that was pretty much the story for Native Americans since the early 1600s when the first settlers arrived, the constant battle of between settlers and Native Americans and the constant loss of land on behalf of the Native Americans. Native Americans are going to disagree with the Treaty of Paris, which eventually made the United States a republic. It identified them, recognized them as a country. They object to it because they feel like their lands were being taken away from them without them having a say. Eventually, they lose more land across time through a series of treaties. The Treaty of Stanwix, Fort Stanwix, Treaty of Fort Finney, Treaty of Fort McIntosh. These are all treaties where land speculators will eventually use different types of bribes to take land from Native Americans. Native Americans are eventually catch on and eventually reject those treaties, and so um, they try to make an agreement, but to no avail. So they eventually rise up through the creation of what is known as the Western Confederacy. These are the group of Native Americans who are fighting the United States. Early victories in 1790 and 1791 causes George Washington to double the army and eventually sends troops to put down these rebellions, eventually eventually winning the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which eventually gives way to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which eventually cedes pretty much all of Ohio to the United States for settlement. And so what you're going to see is just basically the movement of Native Americans going west, relocating them to reservations, and then American settlers eventually taking land. Reminder that Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, which eventually are the next three presidents, will eventually agree upon the westward expansion. So remember that Thomas Jefferson wins the 1800 election, which eventually makes him the president and Aaron Burr the vice president. So under the presidency, remember that he is for Western expansion. He eventually reduces the military to reduce costs, right? He felt that the federal government should be reduced and provide more power to the states. Remember, he is a Republican, Democratic Republican. One of the highlights of his presidency is the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France. So he was eventually just looking to purchase rights to New Orleans, to the port of New Orleans. He just wanted to have uh, not only purchase the entire port, just permission to use the port to eventually use for trade. But eventually, France offers the entire territory of Louisiana during this time. So he eventually purchases 1801, which is something that he does. He has no power to as president of the United States, but he eventually does, and eventually grows the nation, doubles the nation, right? And so this section talks about building that Republican empire, and so that's part of it, like growing it for more expansion and eventually creating an empire. So one of the conflicts that arises well here is a conflict between Hamilton and Burr. I know, so we talked about this and during the week. They eventually are challenged to a duel, and eventually Burr eventually kills Hamilton and eventually goes off free because it was a duel. It was part of society rules of the time, the norms, right? So he eventually, um, Thomas Jefferson eventually assigns Lewis and Clark as heading of the exploration to basically document the entire territory that had been purchased.